But if you live in Baghdad and start talking about that and waving the American flag, that's an entirely different thing. You know, you can talk about it here, but being in the crux of it, it's another situation. Stephen Smith lived this. You know, he transported hundreds of runaways. His life in jeopardy. He really lived an incredible life. His property was attacked in Colombia because he was becoming wealthy, and whites didn't like that. You know, they saw this black man being a esteemed figure, and they didn't like that. And there were race riots in Colombia. His property was attacked. He actually left Colombia, and he came here to Philadelphia, and not far from here. He didn't live far from here. And he became a minister. And I speculate in the book why he became a minister. But prior to this, the recording of vital records, births, deaths, marriages, weren't done by the state. They were done in churches. If you were born, that was recorded in your mostly Protestant churches, recorded these births, deaths. Maryland didn't start keeping vital records till like 1878 or so, I think. I don't know when Pennsylvania did. But when Stephen Smith becomes a pastor, he starts legitimizing the black stake in America. He's recording births. He's recording marriages. He's recording deaths. He's giving blacks an identity. You know, whereas prior to that, they're kept on these lists with cattle and sheep, and they don't even have surnames. But Smith is taking these people and giving them an identity. It's a very inspiring story. Here in Philadelphia, he starts funding a lot of these abolition movements. And he owns property here. He owns almost 300 pieces of property in Philadelphia. One of them is a hall, an abolition hall, that is, again, attacked and burned down. And this is prior to the Civil War. Well, what Stephen Smith does is he files a lawsuit against the city of Philadelphia for not protecting his property, and he wins. He won $75,000 from the city of Philadelphia for not protecting his property. That's an amazing thing, because, you know, most of America at that point in time thinks of blacks as slaves, as an inferior thing. This black man stood up to a white kind of aristocracy, you know, a white class, and he filed a lawsuit and won it. Later on in his life, what Stephen Smith does is he starts the first retirement home for blacks. The Stephen Smith Towers still are standing on Girard Avenue and 44th Street. You know, so he has an entire, he cares about his black community from birth to death, and it's a pretty amazing story. Sorry, I got off a pace here. I want to talk a little bit about the, it's okay, no problem. I want to talk a little bit about the person who painted these portraits. His name is James Stidham. And when I went to the Atwater Kent had identified this black artist as John Stidun, S-T-I-D-U-N. And it was really just a miscategorization by Atwater Kent. They just made a mistake. They have so much material over there. It's they're on a shoestring budget and they've got a lot to do. It's not a problem with Atwater Kent. Sure.
I'm so sorry. What's the name of the abolition hall? Was there a name for it? And what year did that happen?
Pennsylvania Hall was burned down. I want to say
you're talking about Pennsylvania Hall.
Yeah, it was burned down.
So he's the one who funded that.
Yes, he was an investor in that, and he also had another property too. Off the top of my head, I don't remember what it was, but then that property was burned. There were several race riots in Philadelphia. This is around the late 1840s, early 1850s, where runaways are having a stake here. There's free blacks, and there's tension. Sure.
I just wanted to add that Pennsylvania Hall was burned down because the women's rights movement,
that's what I read.
Yeah, the women's suffragettes that were promoting, you know, rights for women and also for blacks, and so they burned it down. But I didn't realize that Stephen Smith had paid for building that hall.
Yeah, he was an investor, and there was also, as I said, another hall that he owned right around the same time period, give or take 2 or 3 years. It was also burned down. Those records are part of the Philadelphia. You can find them, the legal records that transpired and how he won it. He had assistance from Quakers. There was a Quaker abolition thing, and he worked closely with Quakers. For English movements. But let me just talk about James Stidham for a minute. The Atwater Kent had identified the person who painted the Stephen Smith portrait as John Stidham, and it was just a miscalculation. It was an error on Atwater Kent. The gentleman's name was James Stidham, and when I saw the name Stidham, I knew that to be a Swedish colonial surname. So I said, hey, I know what this surname is. So I dug into census reports, and I dug into maps, and I found something interesting here in Cecil County. And again, this is it's a plausible explanation of what occurred. The Stidham family, Timon Stidham, came into the New Sweden colony in 1638, I think, when he came back and forth a number of times. And he was married 4 times, and he had dozens of kids. So by the time you get into the 1800s, there's a lot of Stidhams around Wilmington, Philadelphia, and they're kind of making their way down the Appalachian Trail. A lot of the Stidhams also were slave owners. You know, a lot of the New Sweden settlers who had stayed on, especially the ones who went down to Maryland, lived on plantations, and they got into slave owning. And some of them got into it in a marked way. It's starting to come out now with the Benjamin Chew papers that are published, that just got published recently. There were plantations in Pennsylvania and Maryland and New Jersey and Delaware that had hundreds of slaves. You know, you usually talk about slavery in this area, you're saying, oh, there were a couple of house slaves. No, there were large plantations. The Stidham family had a number of Stidhams had slaves. I printed out this. You can pass it around here, Lisa. This is from the 1700s. This is William Stidham looking for one of his runaways. You know, so and it's not uncommon to find advertising for runaways, slaves. So what I found here in Cecil County was that on one side of the Sassafras River in Cecil County was a man by the name of Henry Stidham, who owned slaves. On the other side of the Sassafras River in Kent County was James Stidham, non-white James Stidham lived there. On the north side of the Sassafras County, next to Henry Stidham, the slave owner, lived a guy by the name of Calk, Jacob Calk, who was also a Swedish settler. He was a slave owner, had a plantation. On the south side were non-white Calks. So it looked to me like there was a community of mixed race individuals who were the children of white slave masters and black female slaves who lived in Kent County. They wanted to be close to their mother, they wanted to be close to their father, but
Cecil County, wasn't it?
yeah, well, Cecil County is on the north side of the Sassafras River. Kent County is on the south side of the Sassafras River. So it looks like they took these illegitimate children and they lived in Kent County next to one another so they could be close to their mother and father, yet they weren't recognized in Cecil County when they went to the Protestant churches. They didn't have to fess up to the fact that they had illegitimate biracial children. And I think that's an important point, folks, that I want to talk about. When these white slave masters started to have biracial children, it was an important thing not to claim parentage to them for a number of reasons. You know, one had to do with just having extramarital affairs. You know, white women that, you know, didn't appreciate their husbands philandering with them, you know, so they didn't want to claim parentage through that. Secondly, inheritance was big. They would have white children. They didn't want to have claims on their plantations with biracial children that weren't their legitimate heirs. So they were inheritance claims that they wanted to make sure that their identity was hidden, their parentage was hidden. You know, thirdly, blacks weren't allowed in white churches at that point in time. You couldn't come to church with your black